Bill Gates has come under heavy fire in recent days. The hashtag #ExposeBillGates recently started trending under suspicion relating to conspiracies about his correlation to coronavirus. This has also brought his relationship with Jeffrey Epstein, the convicted pedophile and sex offender, back into the light. With so much information going in and out, it's hard to know what you can believe and what you can't. That's why today we are getting into the facts, whether or not Bill Gates has had a hand in the pandemic, as well as the true nature of his relationship with the now infamous pedophile. Before we get started, remember to subscribe to the Top 10 Owl for more great content like this every day. Over the past decade, Bill Gates has been warning about the lack of preparation and systems in place to deal with infectious diseases and threats that could lead to a pandemic. Now that the world is actually in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, some conspiracy theorists are now blaming Bill Gates for the pandemic. People on social media are accusing Bill Gates of starting the coronavirus and also the pandemic. This is after Gates has spent much of the second half of his career initiating and supporting efforts to prevent and control infectious diseases via the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, which has funded some of our Phi-Core team's computer modeling research efforts to improve the product distribution and disease control. Bill Gates has pushed for more awareness about the possibility of a pandemic and more efforts to prevent this possibility, such as his TED Talk in 2015. With the outbreak of COVID-19, Bill Gates proved that what he was saying was true. The rumors that he actually was the one who released the virus are nothing but conspiracies. However, that does not mean Bill Gates is a saint. He is taking advantage of the whole situation to try and push his agendas about vaccines and other points. He would like to have worldwide vaccinations, especially of his vaccine for COVID-19 when it's finished. He knows the world is sensitive at the moment, and now is the best time to push these ideas. So while he might have personally released the virus, he is using it to take advantage as much as possible. Now let's start to talk about his relationships with the well-known child predator, Jeffrey Epstein. Unlike many others, Bill Gates started his relationship with Epstein after he was convicted of sex crimes. Jeffrey Epstein, the convicted sex offender who allegedly committed suicide in prison, managed to lure an astonishing array of rich, powerful, and famous men into his orbit. There were billionaires like Leslie Wexner and Donald Trump, politicians like Bill Clinton and Bill Richardson, Nobel laureates like Murray Gell-Mann and Frank Kozlowski, and even royals like Prince Andrew. Bill Gates has done his best to minimize his connections to Mr. Epstein, saying, "I didn't have any business relationships or friendships with him, but as you will soon know, that was a lie." In fact, beginning in 2011, Bill Gates met with Epstein on numerous occasions, including at least 3 times at Mr. Epstein's Palatine, Manhattan townhouse, and at least once staying late into the night, according to interviews with more than a dozen people familiar with the relationship, as well as documents reviewed by the New York Times. Employees of Bill Gates Foundations also paid multiple visits to Epstein's mansion, and Epstein spoke with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and JP Morgan Chase about a proposed multi-billion-dollar charitable fund, an arrangement that had the potential to generate enormous fees for Epstein. His lifestyle is very different and kind of intriguing, although it would not work for me, Mr. Gates emailed colleagues in 2011 after his first get-together with Mr. Epstein. Bridget Arnold, a spokeswoman for Mr. Gates, said that he was referring only to the unique decor of Epstein's residence and the Epstein's habits of spontaneously bringing acquaintances to meet Mr. Gates. Bill Gates and the $51 billion Gates Foundation have championed the well-being of young girls. By the time Mr. Gates and Mr. Epstein first met, Mr. Epstein had served jail time for soliciting prostitution from a minor and was required to register as a sex offender. Ms. Arnold said that high-profile people had introduced Bill Gates and Jeffrey Epstein, and they had met multiple times to discuss philanthropy. 2 members of Bill Gates' inner circle, Boris Nicola and Milena Walker, were close to Mr. Epstein and at a time functioned as an intermediate between the 2 men. Ms. Walker met Epstein in 1992, 6 months after graduating from the University of Texas. Epstein, who was an advisor to Mr. Wexner, the owner of Victoria's Secret, told Mrs. Walker that he could land her an audition for a modeling job there. According to Mr. Walker, she traveled later to New York and stayed in the Manhattan apartment building that Mr. Epstein owned. After she graduated from medical school, she said Mr. Epstein hired her as a science advisor in 1998. Ms. Walker later met with Steven Selinsky, a senior executive at Microsoft who became the president of Windows Division, and she moved to Seattle with him. In 2006, she joined the Gates Foundation with the title of Senior Program Officer. At the foundation, Miss Walker met and befriended Mr. Nikolic, a native of what's now Croatia and a former fellow at the Harvard Medical School who was the foundation's science advisor. Mr. Nikolic and Bill Gates frequently traveled and socialized together. Mrs. Walker, who remained in close touch with Epstein, introduced him to Mr. Nikolic, and the men became friendly. Epstein and Bill Gates first met face-to-face on the evening of January 31st in 2011 at Mr. Epstein's townhouse in Upper East Side. They were joined by Dr. Eva Anderson Dubin, a former Miss Sweden who Epstein once dated, and her 15-year-old daughter. The gathering started at 8 and lasted several hours, according to Miss Arnolds, who's Bill Gates' spokeswoman. Epstein subsequently boasted about the meeting in the emails to his friends and associates. "Bill's great," he wrote in one, reviewed by the Times. Bill Gates in turn praised Epstein's charms and intelligence. Emailing colleagues the next day, he said, "A very attractive Swedish woman and her daughter dropped by, and I ended up staying there quite late." Bill Gates soon saw Epstein again. At a TED conference in Long Beach, California, attendees spotted two men engaging in private conversation. Later that spring, on May 3rd in 2011, Mr. Gates again visited Mr. Epstein at his New York mansion, according to emails about meetings and photographers reviewed by the Times. Around that time, the Gates Foundation and JP Morgan were teaming up to create the Global Health Investment Fund. Its goal was to provide individual and institutional investors the opportunity to finance late-stage global health technologies that may have potentials to save millions of lives in low-income countries. As the details of the funds were being hammered out, Mr. Stanley told JP Morgan colleagues that Mr. Epstein wanted to be brought into the discussion, according to two people familiar with the talks. Mr. Epstein was an important JP Morgan customer, holding millions of dollars in accounts at the bank and referring many wealthy clients to the company. Epstein pitched an idea for a separate charitable fund to JP Morgan officials, including Mr. Stanley and the Bill Gates advisor, Mr. Nikolic. He envisioned a vast fund seeding with Mr. Gates Foundation money, the world's focus on health projects around the world. According to 5 people involved in or briefed on the talks, including current and former Gates Foundation and JP Morgan employees. In addition to the Gates money, Epstein planned to round up donations from his wealthy friends and hopefully from JP Morgan's richest clients. Epstein thought he could personally benefit. He circulated a 4-page proposal that included suggestions that he'd be paid 0.3% of whatever money was raised, according to one person who saw the proposal. If Mr. Epstein had raised $10 billion, for example, then he would have amounted in $30 million in fees. Miss Arnold said Bill Gates and the foundation had been unaware that Mr. Epstein had been seeking any fees. She said Mr. Epstein did propose to Bill Gates and then foundation officials ideas, and he promised would unleash hundreds of billions of dollars for the global health-related work. In late 2011, at Gates' instructions, the foundation sent a team to Mr. Epstein's townhouse to have a preliminary talk about philanthropic fundraising, according to 3 people that were there. Mr. Epstein told his guests that if they searched his name into the internet, they might conclude he was a bad person for what he'd done, soliciting prostitution from an underage girl. Was in, quote, no worse than stealing a bagel, 2 people said. Some of the Gates Foundation employees said that they had been unaware of Mr. Epstein's criminal record and that they had been shocked to learn that the foundation was working with a sex offender. They worried that it could have serious damage to the foundation's reputation. In early 2012, another Gates Foundation team met Epstein at his mansion. He claimed that he had access to trillions of dollars of his clients' money that he could put into proposed charitable funds, a figure so preposterous that it left his visitors doubting Mr. Epstein's credibility. Bill Gates and Epstein kept seeing each other. Miss Arnold would not say how many times the two had met. In March 2013, Mr. Gates flew on Mr. Epstein's Gulfstream plane to Torbetto Airport in New Jersey and Palm Beach, Florida, according to flight manifests. 6 months later, Mr. Nikolic and Bill were in New York for a meeting related to Schrödinger, a pharmaceutical software company in which Gates had a large investment. On that trip, Epstein and Gates met for dinner and discussed the Gates Foundation and philanthropy, Miss Arnold said. And in October 2014, Mr. Gates donated $2 million to the Massachusetts Institute of Technology's Media Lab. University officials described the gift in internal emails as having been directed by Epstein. There was no intention nor explicit ask for the funding to be controlled in any manner by Epstein. Soon afterwards, the relationship between Epstein and Gates had appeared cooled. The charitable fund that had been discussed with the Bill Gates Foundation never materialized. Mr. Epstein complained to the acquaintance at the end of 2014 that he had stopped talking to him, according to a person familiar with the discussion. The relationship, however, wasn't entirely served. At least 2 senior Gates Foundation officials maintained contact with Mr. Epstein until late 2017, according to former foundation employees. Ms. Arnold said that the foundation was not aware of any such contact. Over time, Gates and his team realized Epstein's capabilities and ideas were not legitimate, and all contact with Epstein were discontinued, she said. Days before Epstein apparently hanged himself in a Manhattan jail cell on August 10th, he amended his will and named Mr. Nikolic a fallback executor in the event that one of the 2 primary executioners were unable to serve. Mr. Nikolic, who is now running a venture capital firm with Gates as one of the investors, said that he was shocked to be named in Mr. Epstein's will. He said in a statement to the Times, "I deeply regret ever meeting with Epstein." So do you think Bill Gates should be held responsible? Let us know down in the comments, and remember to subscribe to Top 10 Owl for more content like this every day. And also drop a like if you think Epstein didn't kill himself.